In terms of important shifts that have impacted public opinion in Europe, we are looking at really two key changes. One is the change to a multi-party system in former communist countries, and also the move to a free market economy in former communist countries. On the political side, we are also then asking about democracy and attitudes towards democracy so that we can compare attitudes in East and Western Europe. And on the economic side, we're asking about the current economic situation and the future of the economy in countries. So first, in the former communist countries, what we find, I think, is very impressive, that in most of the countries we surveyed in 91, in 2009, and again this year in 2019, we're finding that people are saying that the changes have been positive on the change to a multi-party system. These have been good for their countries. And also in the change to a free market system, publics in Eastern and Central Europe are saying this has been good for our country. They approve of this change. There are some exceptions in terms of intensity of feeling that this is a positive change. We see lower percentages in Russia, Ukraine. Bulgaria is saying these changes have been positive, both with regard to economic and political changes. But overall, if you look across the countries we surveyed in Central and Eastern Europe, the attitude is that the change in the political system, the change in the economic system, these have been for the better. Now, when we look at what publics in both East, Central, and Western Europe say about current economic conditions and the future of their economy, there is great variation. And actually, it's interesting to see that some of the more optimistic opinion we find in countries like Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, as well as some of the Northern European countries. But actually in Southern Europe, and even in a country like France or UK, there's a considerable number of people who are worried about the economic future, for example. And when we ask about democracy, it's also the case that it's not necessarily a contrast between people in Eastern, Central Europe, and Western Europe in terms of how satisfied they are with democracy and how it's working. In fact, we find frustration with democracy in countries like France, Italy, Spain, more frustration with democracy than we find in Poland or Lithuania, for example. And so I think in some ways the changes that we see reflected in our survey have not been evenly experienced in Central and Eastern Europe, but we also find that some of the biggest differences are not actually between Eastern and Western Europe, but in some ways between Northern and Southern Europe or other divisions in Europe. So a lot has changed, Europe has changed, and we find that it's a very complex landscape politically and economically. There's a number of key findings for us. The first and foremost, again, is that overall, the change to a free market system, to a competitive multi-party political system, there are very few regrets among publics in Eastern and Central Europe about those changes. Those are seen as positive. And that is the core two questions that we asked in 91, in 2009, and again in 2019. We did see in 2009 not such a positive attitude, but that was during the global recession. And I think that was a context that was important for answers. But today, 30 years on, we are seeing a positive assessment of the political and economic changes in this part of the world. I think in terms of surprising findings, I think mostly I would say some of the most vivid or impressive findings are about the fact that the divides aren't east-west necessarily in terms of economic and political attitudes. However, cultural values, when it comes to views on homosexuality, for example, we definitely see an east-west divide still. So homosexuality is much more accepted in Western Europe than East and Central Europe. So I think it's important, with that as an example, to consider that the changes that we've seen politically and economically are not the entire picture. There are also cultural factors that we should consider, and in some areas at least, Eastern and Central Europe continue to be very different culturally from publics in the West. Well, I think one of the big questions politically is what is ahead of Europe in the future, and what the future holds, I think, will be depend a bit, one could say, on attitudes towards the EU. And we asked about attitudes towards the European Union. What is interesting there, again, is it's not the case that newer members of the EU are more frustrated or less happy necessarily with the EU. We actually find in Poland high support for the EU. We find even in Hungary high support, favorable attitudes towards the EU. There's a sense that membership has been good among many of the publics we survey in Central and Eastern Europe, that membership in the EU is positive. The economic benefits are a bit more varied in terms of how publics rate those. But interestingly enough, there is skepticism about the economic benefits in a country like Italy as much as there is in Bulgaria. So again, it's not a simple story of the newer member states are still looking for more positive changes from being members of the EU. In fact, many of them are very happy to be members of the EU. And it's not simply the case that long-established members are more confident about the EU. I think it's a more complex story where we're seeing that countries really have their own stories and their own histories, as the question was posed, that are influencing how they view the EU today. And I think views of the EU will be part of understanding how Europeans in all these different countries think about the future.